So, as you know, Agnew is one of the critics of theoretical integration. And one argument that he makes is that we need to shift our thinking from theories to risk and protective factors. In other words, we need to identify those factors that make criminal offending more likely and those factors that make criminal offending less likely. And he does this by identifying 5 life domains that he argues affect criminality. So, our self, which is basically our level of self control, our level of, or our threshold of irritability, how we react to different situations, whether or not they're emotional, whether or not they're rooted in anger. And he identifies that these traits of the self we carry throughout our life. The next life domain he talks about is family. And under family, this has to do with the marriage that you have. It has to do with how your parents treated you. Was there abuse? Was there support? Were your parents criminals? And so your family can affect your involvement in crime. The next domain is school. And school is linked to your bonds or attachments to your teachers. It's linked to the value and the quality of that education. So if your school's poorly funded, obviously you're much more likely to engage in crime. And then the experiences that occur at school. So are you bullied, for example? Then you have your peers or your friends. Right? Your peers or your friends, as we know, are greatly impact our behavior. The final one is work. If you're living under poor working conditions, if you have a job, if you're granted benefits, all of that is going to affect the likelihood of engaging in crime. Now, Agnew describes that each of these domains affect criminality differently, and they affect criminality differently at each stage in the life course. So again, you can see we have another developmental theory here. He also explains that criminality affects these life domains. So your involvement in crime is going to affect whether or not you keep your job. It's going to affect whether or not you get kicked out of school. It's going to impact your family. It is going to determine your friends, right? And obviously, it's going to affect who you are. Social environment and one's position in the social system also affect life domains. So social environment could be whether you're poor, whether you have a low socioeconomic status, whether you live in a socially disorganized community. Your position in the social system would be your class, your race, your ethnicity, your gender, your age, right? All of these also affect your standing in those life domains. So Agnew describes that crime is most likely when our constraints against crime are low and our motivations for crime are high. Now, those 5 life domains affect constraints and motivations. Okay? So let's start with constraints. External constraints have to do with the likelihood of being caught and punished. This could be rules, how well your behavior is monitored, etc. External constraints could also be stakes in conformity, right? Your informal social controls. So how attached you are to your parents, how committed you are to your school, how how or whether you even have a job. And then your internal constraints are basically your self-control. So I'm sure here you could already identify certain theories that are emerge, right? Self-control, you should automatically think Govertson and Hershey. Stakes in conformity, you should automatically think Hershey, right? Likelihood of being caught and punished, you should automatically think a rational choice theory or routine activities theory or even Govertson and Hershey's theory about effective parenting. Motivations include both enticements and pressures. So enticements are your peers, your role models, right? Anyone who is pulling you into crime. Pressures have to do with strain, right? These are things that are pushing you into crime. And if you remember pulling and pulling from Reckless, right? You have these strains or these negative emotions. So when our constraints against crime are low, so when we have no stakes or weak stakes in conformity, or we have low self-control, we're more likely to engage in crime. And when we have peers who are engaged in crime and we have negative emotions, experience strain, we are more likely to engage in crime. So again, these life domains affect constraints and motivations. So obviously yourself would be like having low self-control. Your family could be some kind of enticement, right, where you're abused. Your school could also be some kind of could be some kind of pressure in which you're being bullied. Your peers would be an enticement because they're engaging in crime. Your work could be a pressure. But it could also be a lack of a constraint, right? Being unemployed, you don't have the constraints. So essentially, you could become trapped in a web of criminal offending because these constraints and motivations also affect your domains. Right? So your work could affect how you think about yourself. Your work could also influence your peers. It's going to impact your family. And criminal offending also affects these domains. So if you engage in crime, it's going to impact work, school, etc., which will then impact constraints and motivations. So each of these then are contemporaneous and nonlinear. Contemporaneous means it's contemporary, right? It's occurring in the now. So sometimes the criminal offending can affect the domain within a very short period of time, several weeks, or the domain can affect criminal offending also in a very short period of time. Nonlinear means that it doesn't occur in a straight line, even if that straight line is a diagonal. Each individual has a threshold. So you have a threshold for irritability. You have a threshold for how you deal with problems with your parents. And that threshold affects the domains and can provoke or limit criminal offending. Therefore, it is non-linear. So while Agnew identifies some theoretical concepts, he doesn't combine theories in the same way. Instead, he identifies common risk factors for engaging in crime. And he argues that criminologists can come behind these risk factors, despite what each of the individual theories say. So the next theory is Cullen's social support theory. It's in the next lecture.